Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So we did it. We're finally on the last Planeswalker. It's only been 5 videos, but today we're doing Ajani, the last of the original 5. I feel like I've learned a lot going through all of this, and it's actually made me a better artist, which is a good thing. I hope everyone's enjoyed it along the way. But today let's finish this up, so let's get into the video. So as always, I start with the eyes. I know, or at least I'm pretty sure, that generally Ajani's eyes are portrayed as blue, but going along with the theme I was doing, matching the eyes with the color of mana that the Planeswalker is associated with, his would be white. A little harder to do a white glowing eye, but I started like normal by putting down a light layer of golden color before blending that in with a colorless blender, then going back with a darker golden marker to create more of the edge. However, this one got a little bit away from me. I wanted it to be more white than it was, but it ended up being a little bit more golden than I was planning, which kind of stinks. But then I just used black to outline the eye like a normal line would look before I moved on to start doing his fur. Ajani overall tends to have a pretty light fur color, which is going to be a bit harder if anyone remembers from the Liliana video how hard it was getting that pale color of the skin. So what I decided to do was to start with a little bit of colorless blender to put down in the areas that I wanted the brightest highlights before I used a skin tone to put down my lightest layer of color. I wasn't too worried about going over the areas where he'd have his markings on his face. I'm just going to take a darker color afterwards and go over it anyways, which isn't going to affect the lighter colors I put down. So taking my time, I worked in my lightest skin tone because I wanted to make sure that the fur stayed light before I put down any darker colors and it didn't get too dark on me too fast and was irreversible. Then when I got it to where I wanted it, that's when I started putting in some of those darker golden colors before bringing back my latest skin tone to blend them in seamlessly. To make sure that the fur kept coming out how I wanted it to, I slowly blended in my grays to give better detail, along with all the darker golden colors, moving very slowly so it didn't get too dark too fast. And the last thing I did before moving on to the darker side of the face was to use a warmer toned gray to add in just where you would start to see darker shadows. Moving on to the darker side of the face, I took the same approach, however this time I didn't use the colorless blender first. Instead, I just used directly into using my E50 skin tone, which is the lightest skin tone, and put down a base layer in the section I wanted to work, before going over it with a light gray to add in just where I wanted my shadows to start showing up. Then after that light layer of gray, I kept building up my colors just like I did on the other side, except on this side they become a lot darker and a lot richer because this is the side of the face that's going to be in shadow. And then I used this same procedure to finish the rest of the mouth and his chin. Now that the base color of the face was done, I wanted to go over where his markings would be with a very light peach-ish brown color. I used a very light color mostly so that I could mark where the areas would be, not necessarily to create the final tones, just so that they didn't get lost in the drawing and the pencil didn't get too covered up. I also wanted to do this step before I put down any of the color pencil because Copic markers don't really like to go over color pencil that well, and the color will actually bleed away from where the pencil is sitting. After those markings were done, I went over them with a lighter brown before going over them with a darker brown, but leaving enough of the lighter brown where the highlights would normally be. Like normal cats, for his nose and mouth, they're a skin tone. What I first started by doing was putting down a darker skin tone before going over it with darker shades, moving on from a maroon to a darker gray, all the way to a dark red, filling out the shadows as I went before going over it with the darkest color of black. This same exact process, although one layer of gray went down first, I repeated for doing the mouth as well. Then before moving on from the rest of the face, I wanted to make sure that there was a lot of detail built into it. So this is where I started going in with color pencil to build up some of that detail. As you can see here, I started with a gray color pencil, just starting to put in strokes that follows the way the fur would have naturally laid on his face to give it more detail. Going over all the face, I do this with different color grays to give it different shading values and with a few shades of brown so that you have different colors mixed in there. And then at the very end, I go over it lightly just with a little bit of Copic marker to set those colors in. The Copic marker can make the color pencil fade a little bit, which I actually wanted. However, like I said, it doesn't like to go perfectly down over the color pencil, but with the darker colors, I found that it works out well enough that you can't notice and actually gives a unique color blending. Then continuing on, I use the same type of color pencil technique throughout the rest of the face, putting down darker and lighter colors where you want both shadows and highlights. So moving on to his mane, which fills out the rest of the image, I use a lot of the same techniques that I used on doing the face. Where I want the lightest highlights to be, I put down a very light coating of colorless blender before putting down that lightest skin tone and slowly blend in those darker golden colors and those darker grays. One thing I really wanted to make sure to do was to make sure my strokes with the Copic marker follows the way his hair would naturally curl. That way it really looks like strands of hair that would naturally be sitting there. And the last thing you can see me doing here is actually taking a little bit of what would be brighter pink and mixing it in so that you have some warmer tones that are jumping out. These same techniques I wanted to use throughout the rest of the mane on his head. After I put down that lightest color of skin tone, what I wanted to do to give a separation where the brightest highlight would be is actually put down an edge of color pencil around, leaving a little bit of white space in between the color pencil that edges the hair and where that skin tone would be, so that you had a bright edge to the fur. And then I blended like I did in the rest of the piece. Again, I wanted to make sure that all my brush strokes followed the way the hair would naturally lie. The difference here between most of the other hair is where the mane falls in shadow. This will have a lot darker colors in it, and the way the hair falls, there's going to be a transition in shadow from the very dark to the very light of where the shadows of the hair is. And to make up for that, I use a lot of darker grays to create that shadow and relief, and I use a lot heavier color pencil to fill in those areas. A lot of dark grays, even a little bit of black to fill in those shaded areas. The braids on his side of his head is where I knew a lot of tight textures are going to be because of how closely the hair is compacted. So I used most of the same techniques as I did on the rest of the head, but I made sure to make them a little bit darker because of where the hair is, which is mostly in shadow, but I also used a lot more defined brush strokes so that it looks like you can see a lot more of the individual hairs, which gives it a lot more texture. And after the braids are done, I moved on to the lighter side of his mane, which is just like everything else, except it's on the side with more highlights, so it'll just stay in lighter colors. And the last thing to be done was his armor, which after doing all the coloring and color pencil on the rest of him was actually probably the easiest thing to do. It was really just a bottom layer of gray topped with a few layers of gold in darker and darker patterns with a little bit of color pencil put on top. And to make sure I gave a realistic tone to the armor, I made sure that there were multiple bright spots on the armor. So overall, I like this one. This is probably the one that I use the most color pencil on, mostly to give Ajani's fur a lot of texture and to make sure it actually kind of stood out. Like I said before, I'm a huge fan of realism, so I wish it was a little more realistic, which comes with just gaining a little bit more skill over time. Besides that, like I said, I like it. And with that, we finally did it. We got all 5 original Planeswalkers done. If you like this video and you want to see the other ones, the link is in the icon above or the description below. And as always, with this series being finished, if you have something that you want me to draw, leave it in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, go ahead and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Now go make something.